The sterile smell of the recovery wing usually brought a sense of peace, but today it smelled like terror. Allison Harper sat on the edge of her hospital bed, her hand trembling as she touched the surgical bandage wrapped around her abdomen. Only 48 hours ago, she had lost her father and her unborn child in a whirlwind of grief that felt like a physical weight crushing her chest. The silence of the room was shattered when the heavy oak door slammed against the wall with a deafening crack. Blake. Her stepbrother stood there, looking less like a grieving relative and more like a predator who had finally cornered its prey. He didn't offer a hug. He didn't offer a single word of sympathy. Instead, he lunged forward, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated greed. He gripped a thick stack of legal documents in his right hand, shaking them so violently that the paper rattled like dry bones. "Sign it, Allison! Sign the damn papers right now!" he screamed, his voice echoing off the clinical white walls. "You are finished. You are done in this city. If you think for one single second that you are walking away with a dime of the Harper estate, you are even more delusional than your pathetic father was." Allison tried to find her voice, but it was buried under layers of trauma. "Blake, please. Dad isn't even in the ground yet. How can you be doing this?" He didn't answer with words. He answered with force. Blake stepped into her personal space, the smell of expensive bourbon and stale cigarettes rolling off him in waves. He grabbed her shoulder, his fingers digging into her skin like talons, and before she could even scream, he swung his open hand. The slap was so loud it sounded like a gunshot. The world tilted on its axis. Allison felt the searing, white-hot sting across her cheek as she was sent sprawling back onto the hospital mattress, her internal stitches screaming in agony. She tasted copper, the metallic tang of blood filling her mouth. As she looked up, her vision blurred by tears, she saw Blake hovering over her, his eyes cold and soulless. "You have 24 hours, he hissed, leaning down until his lips were inches from her ear. "If these papers aren't notarized by noon tomorrow, I won't just take the money. I will make sure the police find enough evidence in your apartment to put you away for the rest of your miserable life." "Choose wisely, sister." He turned on his heel and marched out, leaving the door wide open for the nurses to see her shame. Allison lay there, gasping for air, clutching her stomach. The physical pain was nothing compared to the realization that had just set in. Her father hadn't died of a broken heart. He had been surrounded by snakes, and now the vipers were coming for her. She reached for her phone with a shaking hand. She didn't call the police. She didn't call the hospital security. She called the only person in Seattle who knew where the skeletons were buried. She called Grace. "Grace," Allison whispered into the receiver, her voice breaking. "He hit me. He tried to kill the memory of Dad right here in the hospital. I need everything we talked about, every file, every recording. We aren't just going to fight them, Grace. We are going to destroy them." On the other end of the line, the old woman's voice was as sharp as a razor. "I've been waiting for this call, Allison. Put your shoes on. The war has officially begun." The rain in Seattle didn't just fall that evening, it punished the pavement. Allison stood in the driveway of her childhood home in Bellevue, watching her life being tossed onto the wet asphalt like trash. The heavy front doors, the ones her father had hand-carved from mahogany, swung open, and two burly movers stepped out, carrying her mother's antique vanity. They didn't even try to be careful. They dropped it near the curb, and the sound of the vintage glass cracking felt like a knife twisted in Allison's ribs. "Stop! What are you doing?" Allison screamed, her voice hoarse from the cold. From the shadows of the grand entryway, Evelyn stepped out. Her stepmother was draped in a floor-length cashmere coat, a glass of vintage cristal in her hand, looking as if she were hosting a gala rather than destroying a life. She didn't look sad. She didn't look like a woman who had buried her husband 48 hours ago. She looked victorious. "Oh, Allison, dear, didn't you get the memo?" Evelyn's voice was like velvet dipped in poison. "The locks have been changed. The security codes have been wiped, and according to the New Testament of your father's will, the one he signed while you were too busy losing his grandchild, this house belongs to me, and by extension, it belongs to Blake." Allison felt the world spinning. "You're lying! My father loved this house. He would never leave it to someone who treated him like an ATM. Where is the real lawyer, Evelyn? Where is Mr. Vance? Evelyn let out a sharp, tinkling laugh that chilled Allison to the bone. Vance is retired, darling. We have new representation now. Professional men who understand that a man in your father's fragile state needed a firm hand to guide his legacy. Now get off the property before I have the guards trespass you. You're making the neighborhood look tacky. As the heavy doors slammed shut, Allison collapsed onto a sodden cardboard box containing her old photo albums. The ink was already bleeding into the paper. She was homeless. She was penniless. And her father's killers were drinking champagne in his bed. But then a pair of headlights cut through the fog. A beat-up silver sedan pulled into the cul-de-sac. The door opened, and Grace stepped out, holding a tattered umbrella. The elderly woman didn't say a word. She just walked over, wrapped a warm wool blanket around Allison's shoulders, and pulled her toward the car. Let them have their moment, honey, Grace whispered, her eyes fixed on the glowing windows of the mansion. Greed makes people loud, but silence. Silence is where we build the gallows. I have the ledger, Allison. I have the medical records your father hid behind the water heater. He knew, Allison. He knew they were killing him. As the car pulled away, Allison looked back one last time. She saw Blake standing at the upstairs window, holding up a gold watch, her father's watch, and waving it with a sneer. Enjoy it while you can, Blake, Allison whispered, her eyes turning into flint. Because when I come back for that house... I'm not bringing a lawyer, I'm bringing a storm. The architects of murder. The small apartment above Grace's garage smelled of lavender and old paper, a stark contrast to the cold, metallic scent of the hospital. Allison sat at a cramped wooden table, surrounded by mountains of documents that Grace had spent years meticulously organizing. Her cheek was a deep, bruised shade of purple now, a constant, throbbing reminder of Blake's violence. But as she flipped through the pages of her father's private medical diary, the physical pain vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating rage that burned brighter than any fever. Look at the dates, Grace, Allison whispered, her voice trembling as she pointed to a series of entries from 6 months ago. June 14th. Dad writes that he's feeling dizzy. June 20th. He says his vision is blurring. July 2nd. He writes that Evelyn insisted on taking over his medication schedule because he was becoming forgetful. But my father was never forgetful. He was a man who memorized entire lines of code in his head. He was being systematically erased. Grace leaned over, her spectacles reflecting the harsh light of the desk lamp. It wasn't just the memory, Allison. Look at the bank statements from the Harper Foundation. Your father set that foundation up to provide scholarships for underprivileged kids in Seattle. It was his pride and joy, but starting in August, the withdrawals began. Small at first, 10,000 here, 20,000 there. By October, the bleed was unstoppable. $500,000 moved to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. And look who authorized the transfers. Allison looked at the signature at the bottom of the digital wire transfer. Blake. He hadn't even waited for their father to die. He was dismembering the company while Jonathan Harper was still breathing. He was gambling it away, Allison realized, her stomach turning. Blake didn't just want the inheritance. He needed it to stay alive. I remember hearing rumors about his debts to some very dangerous people in Vegas. If he didn't pay them back, he wouldn't just be poor. He would be dead. That's why he's so desperate. That's why he hit me. He's a cornered animal. But the most damning evidence was buried in a manila folder labeled Project Phoenix. It was a secret audit Jonathan had commissioned just weeks before his final heart attack. Allison pulled out a lab report from a private toxicology clinic. Her heart stopped. Grace, look at this. This isn't a medical record for heart disease. This is a report on a hair follicle sample Dad sent in secret. It shows elevated levels of arsenic and digoxin. They weren't just giving him too much medication. They were poisoning him slowly. They were turning his own body into a cage until his heart simply gave up. The realization hit Allison like a physical blow. Her father had spent his final months in a state of perpetual terror, knowing the woman he shared a bed with and the son he had tried to mentor were murdering him one dose at a time. He had been a prisoner in his own home. Every I love you from Evelyn had been a lie. Every feel-better dad from Blake had been a death sentence. He knew he didn't have much time, Grace said, her voice heavy with grief. That's why he came to me. He told me, Grace, if something happens to me, tell Allison to look for the blue folder. Tell her to trust no one but Vance. But they got to Vance first. They threatened his family, Allison. They forced him into retirement and replaced him with that shark, Marcus Thorne. Thorne is a fixer. He doesn't practice law, he buries crimes. Allison stood up, her eyes fixed on a photo of her father on the desk. He was smiling, standing on the deck of his boat, looking strong and invincible. They think they've won because they have the house, the cars, and the bank accounts. They think I'm just a grieving girl with a bruise on her face. They want me to be weak. They want me to crawl away and hide. She grabbed a black marker and drew a thick, heavy line through Blake's name on a diagram of the company's board of directors. We aren't going to the police yet, Allison said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. If we go now, Thorne will find a way to suppress the evidence. He'll call the toxicology report unverifiable. No, we need a confession. We need to catch them in the act of being who they really are. Blake is greedy, and greed makes people stupid. If I offer him something he wants more than my silence, he will walk right into the trap. What are you going to offer him, Allison? Grace asked, looking worried. I'm going to offer him the one thing Dad kept hidden even from them, Allison replied with a grim smile. The Omega Key. It's the encryption code for the company's primary intellectual property, the software that runs the entire Harper grid. Without it, the company is just a collection of empty office buildings. With it, it's worth billions. Blake will do anything to get that key. He will lie, he will steal, and he will brag about what he did to Dad just to prove he's the smartest man in the room. Allison reached for her coat. The rain was still drumming against the roof, but the cold didn't bother her anymore. She felt like she was made of iron. Call Marcus Thorne's office, Allison commanded. Tell him I'm ready to sign the papers. But tell him I'll only do it at the Harper penthouse. I want Evelyn and Blake there. I want them to feel like they've finally won. I want them to feel so powerful that they forget to be careful. Because tomorrow night the Harper legacy doesn't end, it reborn in blood. She walked to the window and looked out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Blake was celebrating. He was probably wearing her father's watch, drinking her father's scotch, and laughing about the little girl he had slapped in the hospital. Laugh while you can, Blake, she whispered, her breath fogging the glass. Because by this time tomorrow, you won't be worried about the inheritance. You'll be wondering how you're going to survive in a cell with the people you sold out. The game is almost over. And you have no idea who you're actually playing against. The elevator ascended to the top floor of the Harper Plaza with a smooth, silent, mechanical precision that made Allison's skin crawl. This was the summit of her father's world, a glass and steel monument to his brilliance, now occupied by vultures. As the doors slid open, the scent of expensive lilies and floor wax hit her, a smell that had once meant success, but now only signaled corruption. Blake was there, standing in the center of the sprawling living area, his hand draped over the back of a white leather sofa. He looked up, a smug, oily grin spreading across his face as he saw the bruised shadow still lingering on Allison's cheek. He wasn't even pretending to be sorry. Next to him stood Evelyn, clad in a black silk gown that looked more like a victory flag than mourning attire. Her eyes were like shards of ice, scanning Allison for any sign of a concealed weapon or a hidden motive. Look at you, Blake sneered, stepping forward with a glass of amber liquid in his hand. The prodigal daughter returns to the scene of the crime. I'm surprised you had the guts to show your face here after that little performance in the hospital. I thought you'd be halfway to Europe by now, living off the scraps I was generous enough to offer. Allison didn't flinch. She kept her back straight, her chin tilted at an angle that screamed defeat, even as her heart hammered a war drum against her ribs. Underneath her oversized blazer, a state-of-the-art digital recorder was pinned to her blouse, its tiny red light blinking like the eye of a judge. I'm not here to fight, Blake, Allison said, her voice sounding small, fragile, and perfectly broken. You won. You and Evelyn took everything. my home, my father's company, even my dignity. I just want it to be over. I want to move on and never hear the name Harper again. Evelyn walked over, her heels clicking against the marble floor with the rhythm of a metronome. She reached out and touched the bruise on Allison's face with a cold finger. A hard lesson, darling, but a necessary one. Some people are born to lead, and others are born to follow. Now, where are the papers? Marcus Thorne is waiting in the library. I'll sign, Allison whispered, her eyes filling with tears that were only half faked. But I know what you're really after. I know you found the offshore accounts, but you can't access the Omega key. You've been trying to hack into the Harper grid for 48 hours, haven't you, Blake? And you realized that without the physical encryption chip, the one Dad gave me on my 21st birthday, the company's stock will crater by Monday morning. Blake's face turned a shade of purple that Allison recognized all too well. It was the color of a man whose greed had finally hit a wall. He set his glass down on a glass table with a deafening clatter. "Where is it?" Blake roared, moving so close she could smell the desperation on his breath. "I know he gave it to you." That old fool thought he was being clever, hiding the keys to the kingdom with a girl who couldn't even keep a pregnancy. "Give it to me, Allison, or I swear to God." "I have it," Allison said, reaching into her pocket and pulling out a small silver USB drive that hummed with a soft blue light. "It's right here. It contains the codes for the entire infrastructure. It's worth $500 million on the open market. I'll give it to you. But I want the truth first. I need to hear it from you. I need to know why Dad had to die so fast." Evelyn stepped in, her voice dropping to a hiss. "He was an old man, Allison. He was slowing down. He was becoming a liability to the growth of this company. We didn't do anything that wasn't inevitable. We just accelerated the process. A little extra digoxin in his morning coffee, a few accidental double doses of his heart meds. He drifted off like he was falling asleep. It was merciful, really." "Merciful?" Allison's voice cracked. "You watched him struggle to breathe. You watched him lose his mind while you were draining his accounts. You poisoned him, Evelyn. And you, Blake, you stood by and watched." Blake laughed, a harsh, jagged sound that filled the room. "I didn't just watch, Allison. I'm the one who switched the bottles. I'm the one who made sure the private nurse was distracted while the doses were being prepared." He was a weak, sentimental old fool who was going to give half the company to a charity foundation. "I deserve that money. I earned it by putting up with his pathetic lectures for 10 years. He snatched the blue drive out of Allison's hand, his fingers trembling with excitement. "Now I have it all. The house, the money, and the key." "You have nothing, Allison. You're just a witness with no proof and a reputation we've already destroyed in the press. Now get out of my sight before I decide to finish what the heart attack started." Allison took a slow step back, a strange, terrifying calm settling over her. She looked at Evelyn, then at Blake, who was already plugging the drive into his laptop with a maniacal grin. "You're right about one thing, Blake," Allison said, her voice no longer trembling. It was as cold as a grave. "Greed does make you stupid. Did you really think I'd bring the real encryption key here? Did you really think I'd give you the power to destroy my father's life work?" Blake froze. He looked at the screen. The drive wasn't loading an encryption key. It was loading a video. A high-definition, multi-angle stream of the very conversation they were having, being uploaded in real time to a secure cloud server. And at the bottom of the screen, a notification popped up. "Broadcasting to Seattle Police Department, Unit 4. Upload 100% complete." "What? What is this?" Blake stammered, his face turning ghostly white. "That," Allison said, pointing to her brooch, "is a 360-degree lens. And that drive? It's a GPS tracker and a wireless transmitter. The police aren't coming, Blake. They're already here." The sound of the penthouse's reinforced glass shattering echoed through the room as flashbangs exploded in a blinding white light. The world inside the penthouse became a chaos of blinding white light and deafening thunder. The elite SWAT team didn't just enter, they breached the sanctuary of the corrupt. Glass rained down like diamonds, clicking against the marble floor as federal agents in tactical gear swarmed the room, their laser sights dancing like red hornets across Blake's chest. "Get down! Hands behind your head!" "Now!" the lead officer bellowed, his voice vibrating through the very floorboards. Blake didn't move at first. He stood there, frozen, the silver USB drive still gripped in his hand like a useless talisman. His eyes were wide, darting from the broken windows to the barrel of a submachine gun pointed directly at his forehead. The smug, arrogant Prince of Seattle was gone. In his place was a terrified, pathetic boy who had finally realized the floor had vanished beneath his feet. "This is a mistake!" Blake shrieked, his voice cracking into a high-pitched wail. "She's crazy! She set us up! I didn't say anything! That recording is a fake!" But Evelyn was smarter, or perhaps she was just more cynical. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She simply sat back on the white leather sofa, her face turning into a mask of cold, porcelain indifference. She watched as an agent stepped forward and snapped heavy steel cuffs around her wrists. She looked at Allison, not with regret, but with a pure, concentrated hatred that would have withered a weaker woman. "You think you've won, Allison?" Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible over the shouting of the officers. "You've destroyed the Harper name. By the time the press is done with this, your father's legacy will be nothing but a sordid crime story. You haven't saved him. You've buried him again." Allison stepped forward, walking right through the debris of the shattered window. She stood inches away from her macheca, her shadow falling over the woman who had tried to steal her life. "The Harper name isn't a pile of money or a glass building, Evelyn," Allison said, her voice steady and resonant. "The Harper name is the truth, and the truth is, you are a murderer. You and Blake are nothing more than common thieves who thought you were too smart to get caught. My father's legacy is me. And I'm still standing." As the officers dragged Blake toward the elevator, he began to struggle, kicking and screaming like a spoiled child losing his favorite toy. "You can't do this! Do you know who I am? I own this city. I'll buy the judge." "I'll buy the entire jury." One of the agents, a woman with a scar across her brow, shoved him hard against the wall. "Shut up, Henderson. We've been tracking your Vegas debts for months. You don't own a damn thing, not even the clothes on your back. Those belong to the federal government now." The penthouse, once a symbol of power, now felt like a cage. Allison watched as they were loaded into separate elevators. She saw the flash of the news cameras waiting in the lobby far below. The vultures had arrived, but this time they weren't there for her. Detective Riley, the woman who had been working with Grace in secret, walked over and placed a hand on Allison's shoulder. She was holding a small evidence bag. Inside was the gold watch Blake had been wearing, Jonathan's watch. "We got them, Allison," Riley said softly. "The toxicology team found the hidden stash of digoxin in Evelyn's private vanity. It's a direct match to the levels in your father's system. And the fake notary? He's already singing. He's naming names to avoid a 20-year sentence. It's over." Allison took the watch. It was still warm from Blake's skin, a sensation that made her shiver with disgust. She wiped it clean on her sleeve and gripped it tight. "Not yet, Detective," Allison replied, looking out over the Seattle skyline. "Now comes the hard part. Now I have to fix everything they broke." She spent the next 4 hours in the back of a police cruiser, giving a formal statement. She didn't leave anything out. She told them about the hospital, the slap, the eviction, and the slow, agonizing decline of her father. By the time she stepped out of the precinct, the sun was beginning to peek through the gray clouds over Elliott Bay. Grace was waiting for her by the curb, sitting in her old silver sedan. The elderly woman didn't say anything. She just opened the door. Allison slumped into the passenger seat and let out a breath she felt she had been holding for a lifetime. "They're in separate cells, Grace," Allison whispered. "Blake is crying." Evelyn is silent. "The silence will be the hardest part for her," Grace said, pulling the car away from the curb. "She spent her whole life talking her way out of trouble. But you can't talk to a stone wall and you can't charm a life sentence." They drove back to the mansion, not to the front door, but to the gates. The police tape was still fluttering in the wind. Allison got out and stood in the driveway. The movers had left her things scattered on the lawn, soaked by the night's rain. She walked over to the box of photo albums she had cried over the night before. She picked up a photo of her father holding her when she was 6 years old. The edges were water damaged, but their smiles were still clear. "I got the house back, Dad," she whispered, her tears finally falling freely. "I got it all back, but God, I would give every single brick and every single dollar just to have one more hour to tell you that I knew. I knew you were trying to protect me." The wind kicked up, rustling the trees that lined the driveway. For a fleeting second, Allison didn't feel the cold. She felt a warmth, like a hand resting gently on her shoulder. It was the feeling of a promise kept. The storm had passed, and though the landscape was scarred, the foundations were still strong. The grand ballroom of the Harper estate was no longer a place of shadows and whispered conspiracies. 1 year had passed since the night of the shattered glass, and today, the floorboards shone with a brilliant, honest glow. Allison Harper stood at the top of the spiral staircase, dressed in a simple, elegant navy suit. She wasn't looking at the expensive art or the crystal chandeliers. She was looking at the faces of the 300 employees who had gathered below, the engineers, the janitors, the coders, and the foremen who had built her father's dream with their own calloused hands. "Thank you all for coming," Allison's voice rang out, projected by the same speakers that had once carried Blake's arrogant laughter. A year ago, this company was being dismembered by greed. Today I am proud to announce that the Harper Foundation has officially restored every single cent stolen from your pension funds, with interest. The roar of applause that followed was deafening. It was the sound of 1,000 weights being lifted off 1,000 shoulders. Allison felt a lump in her throat as she saw Margaret, the head of accounting who had worked for her father for 30 years, wiping tears from her eyes. Justice wasn't just about handcuffs and jail cells, it was about restoration. It was about proving that the good things Jonathan Harper had done wouldn't be erased by the sins of the people who shared his name. But the real victory had happened in a sterile courtroom downtown 6 months earlier. The trial of the century had gripped Seattle, peeling back the layers of Evelyn's Black Widow past. "The prosecution calls Allison Harper to the stand," the bailiff had announced. Allison remembered walking past the defense table, feeling the heat of Evelyn's glare. Her stepmother had aged 10 years in a few months. Her silk gowns had been replaced by a drab orange jumpsuit, and her perfectly coiffed hair was streaked with gray. Next to her, Blake sat slumped in his chair, his eyes darting nervously around the room. He looked small. He looked pathetic. He had tried to flip on his mother, offering to testify against her in exchange for a lighter sentence. But the prosecution didn't need him. They had the Omega recording. The moment the audio played in the courtroom, the sound of Blake bragging about switching the medication bottles, the jury's faces turned to stone. When the recording reached the part where Evelyn described Jonathan's slow death as merciful, one of the jurors had actually gasped and turned away in disgust. "Do you have anything to say to the defendants?" the prosecutor had asked Allison during her testimony. Allison had turned her head slowly to look Blake directly in the eyes. "I don't have words for you, Blake. You weren't a brother. You were a parasite. You took a man who gave you everything, and you treated his life like a line of credit. And Evelyn," Allison's voice had dropped to a cold, hard whisper. "You thought you were the smartest person in every room because you knew how to use a needle and a smile. But you forgot that a house built on poison always collapses from the inside. Enjoy the silence, Evelyn." "You earned it." The verdict had been swift. Guilty on all counts. Blake Henderson was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison for conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, and grand larceny. Because of his violent history and the assault on Allison in the hospital, the judge had ordered he serve his time in a maximum security facility. Evelyn was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. As the guards led her away, she had tried to scream one last time, a jagged, ugly sound that was quickly silenced by the heavy steel doors of the holding cell. The Black Widow had finally run out of husbands to bury. Back in the present, Allison stepped down from the podium and walked toward the gardens. The rain had stopped, and a rare Seattle sun was breaking through the clouds. Grace was sitting on a stone bench by the rose bushes, holding a glass of lemonade and watching the festivities with a quiet, satisfied smile. You did it, Allison, Grace said, patting the seat next to her. Your father's legacy isn't just intact. It's stronger than ever. The new children's wing at the hospital opens next month. The Harper Scholarship Fund is fully endowed. You've turned his grief into a gift. I couldn't have done it without you, Grace, Allison replied, leaning her head on the older woman's shoulder. You were the only one who stayed when the world went dark. I stayed because I knew who you were, Grace whispered. I knew you were a Harper, and Harpers don't break. We just get tempered in the fire. Allison reached into her pocket and pulled out her father's gold watch. She had had it engraved on the back, "The truth endures." She wound it slowly, listening to the steady, rhythmic tick, tick, tick of the gears. It was a heartbeat. A reminder that time eventually catches up to everyone, for better or for worse. A tall man with kind eyes and a professional air walked out of the house toward them. It was David, the lead investigator who had helped bring the federal charges against the offshore accounts. Over the past year, their professional relationship had grown into something deeper, something built on trust and shared values. Ready to go, Allison? David asked, reaching out his hand. The board meeting starts in an hour, and then we have that dinner reservation at the harbor. Allison smiled, a real, radiant smile that reached her eyes. For the first time in years, she wasn't looking over her shoulder. She wasn't waiting for the next blow to fall. She was free. I'm ready, Allison said. She took one last look at the mansion, at the trees, and at the sky. She felt the weight of the past finally settling into the earth, becoming the foundation for a future she would build on her own terms. As they walked toward the car, Allison felt a familiar, gentle stirring in her soul. She thought about the baby she had lost, a grief that would always be a part of her, but no longer a shadow that defined her. She knew that someday she would fill this house with the sound of laughter again. She would tell her children about their grandfather, not the man who was poisoned, but the man who built a world, and the woman who fought through the fire to save it. The game was over. The vipers were in their cages. And for Allison Harper, the sun was finally, beautifully high in the sky. Justice had been served, and the price of the inheritance had been paid in full. She was no longer the victim. She was the architect of her own destiny. Let's go, she said, her voice filled with hope. We have a lot of work to do.